appreciate the invitation and the offer to be a part of this very important conference. It is certainly an honor to be among you and to talk about these very important issues. I was asked to talk about ethics in agricultural production and education. That topic is so broad that there have been entire conferences dealing with that issue. And in discussions with Professor Omagosa, we decided to focus more specifically on ethics in the agricultural curriculum. It fits perfectly with the previous presentation. While we saw things at the very, very broad level, I'm taking it down in this presentation to the individual classroom and what faculty members at our institutions can possibly do to address some of the issues that have been discussed by pretty much all of the speakers this morning. Interesting thing about agricultural ethics is that historically people who have been involved in producing food, doing research on food production, or helping others to learn about it have had limited discussions about the ethics that are associated with the production of food. And in this entire presentation, I will be talking about food production in the very broadest sense, including marketing, processing, etc. There's been a perception among individuals involved in agriculture that providing food for humanity is important to the greater good. And because it is, how can there possibly be any ethical or moral issues associated with reducing or eliminating hunger or starvation? And as a result, while ethics have been a cornerstone of religions and societies for thousands and thousands of years, the discussion about ethics in the context of agriculture, because of the sense that we are doing things for the greater good of society, has been a relatively recent phenomenon. Much of that has been associated with the changes in food production that have been addressed by the previous presenters. The development of knowledge about how to grow food has grown exponentially probably since around 1900 with the rediscovery of Mendel's laws of genetics and the application of it and many other scientific processes to help us understand how to do a better job of producing food. And as a result, as we saw in a couple of the previous discussions, the amount of food produced worldwide has risen dramatically, especially in the last 100 years. While the reasons for that increase tend to be fairly complex, they ultimately boil down to the fact that we have done a better job of growing more food on an individual piece of land. Some of that increase in production has happened because we have more land in production worldwide, but in general, it is because on an individual piece of land we are growing 2, 3, 4, 5 times as much food in that same area as we had 100 years ago. Reasons for that greater intensity of production have many, many components. They can include the improved genetic strains of plants and animals that have been developed over the last 100 years, increased efficiency in water management, increased fertilizer use, increased pesticide use. Here are some slides from FAO that point out these issues. Many of them are very similar to what has been discussed previously. The amount of meat production from, in this case, the last about 45 or 50 years has grown dramatically in the black line on the top slide. In the middle slide, you can see the dramatic increase in nitrogen fertilizer use worldwide. The third shows the increase in areas under irrigation worldwide. And then the last shows pesticide exports, not use so much as exports, but you can see a tremendous increase. These together have increased that intensity of production. And as a result, agriculture has changed. There are differences now compared to maybe even 30 or 40 years ago, but certainly compared to 100 years ago in the structure of farms. The way in which animals are produced, the way in which we produce crops, how we create plant cultivars. We no longer, my background is in plant breeding and genetics, we no longer rely just on a farmer saving seed, but we are at a point now of taking a look at the genomes of individual plants that are important in agriculture and using those to manipulate sometimes conventional selection systems and sometimes actually bringing in new genes from different species. The amount of international food trade has risen dramatically. Food security continues to be an important issue and again was addressed previously. Food safety is something that is demanded more and more by members of our society. So all of these issues affect not only those of us who are involved in agriculture, whether it be in production or research or education, but they affect all of society. And increasingly, society is not saying, well, thank goodness you're raising enough food for us not to starve, but they are asking important questions about agriculture and food. And some of these questions were raised in the previous presentation. For example, will the family farm survive? Should it? Is there a fair and equitable distribution of food within a region, within a country, even within socioeconomic groups? We in the United States have been identifying what we call food deserts, which even exist within individual cities where people in poverty have a very difficult time obtaining the quality food that they're interested in. How should food animals be raised? What impact does that production practice have on profitability, environmental quality? What's the best way to manage soil fertility? What does best mean? Does that have to do with crop yield, economic return, fertilizer availability, sustainability, fertilizer movement in the groundwater, other issues? And then, of course, we can ask those same kinds of questions, and this is hardly the end of all of these kinds of questions. We can ask them about management of weeds, insects, and diseases for plant growth and development. And the interesting thing is that these questions demand answers that are more complex than just simply answering the scientific portion. The challenge for us in higher education is that we are educating our students to understand the science, but they are going to be contributing to society, and they are going to be asked to answer these kinds of questions that involve not only the science, but how it impacts society. They need to answer those kinds of questions to be productive members of this 21st century that we are preparing them for. Most of our students, I would argue, when they answer questions on tests we give them in our classroom, such as, how do you best manage soil fertility, don't realize that from a societal standpoint, we are asking both a scientific and a value question. And our roles as educators is to help our students realize that that is the case. That producing food is not a value-free process, but it involves ethical decisions. Primarily, we want our students to understand the content, knowledge, and skills. The problem is there's too much to put into a class. A very specific example that I know well because it involves me. In the United States higher education system, a standard science course that we teach will have a laboratory that without a laboratory will meet for 50 minutes, 3 times a week for 16 weeks, 40 total hours of classroom education. I started my career teaching genetics in 1977. When I did, I was told, I have no idea whether it was true, that the amount of genetic knowledge worldwide doubled every 3 years. If that's the case, from that point to today, there is 4,000 times more genetic knowledge than there was when I started teaching. The genetics class today meets for 40 hours. And so we somehow have to take that 4,000 times amount of information and put it into the same amount of space that we did before. How can we possibly do that? And that issue is the one that we faced for all of the disciplines that we're involved in and the way all of us teach our discipline. I am changing my perspective, and while it comes from some global kinds of issues, it also comes from very specific experiences that I have had. One of the courses that I teach at the University of Georgia is an organic gardening seminar, and it's taught to a group of 18-year-old students who are beginning college for the very first time. Meets once a week. I had so much stuff to dump into their brains about organic matter, fertility management, propagation, pest management. And then, to make matters worse, I found out that I could teach the class where the students would actually go outside and go in a greenhouse and grow food. I did that, and then the content suffered dramatically. The students went crazy. One of the students said, eating my own food 30 seconds after I harvested was the greatest experience I have ever had. And another student said, "You taught me the reality of food." And so this then gets us to a situation, what do we teach? These kinds of issues are ones that we all face. We teach a smaller and smaller portion of the knowledge in a given class because the amount of knowledge that we have increases, but we still are required to teach the students to become productive members of society. I have become more comfortable letting go of the content knowledge because I have no idea exactly what that is, and it probably changed for every single person that teaches a genetics or a plant pathology or a soils course. I've decided that we need to teach the reality of food, and we'd help our students learn how to learn, emphasizing critical thinking, problem solving, as was mentioned in the previous presentation. One of the ways to do that is to add ethics into our disciplinary teaching. Reality of food is that it impacts everybody, and everyone in society is interested. We are no longer in the 1940s or 30s or 20s when people were just thankful for food. Now they are demanding that they know how food is produced. What if we taught content and context? Is there a right way to create food? One of the many definitions of ethics, and there are probably thousands of them, is doing the right thing. So maybe agricultural ethics could be considered making the right choices about food and food production. And there is tremendous value, I believe, in helping our students understand that. What if we incorporated this kind of idea of agricultural ethics into both undergraduate and maybe even master's and doctoral level courses? I think bringing ethics into our individual classes could help our students understand the processes that are involved in making the right decision. We can, if we bring ethics into the class, help our students understand the processes that people use to make decisions. Oftentimes our students, because they are in the sciences, perceive that ethics and opinions about things are very fuzzy. But ethical theories can help them understand that there is a process that people use to come to the conclusions that they have, and then we can help them understand that in the context of the topics that we might teach. We can provide them, the students, an opportunity to make their own decisions, to look at the reasons and the methods that they use to make those decisions, and to also then understand how people can have a completely different perspective. For example, GMOs, whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, and still have an understanding of the value of the exact opposite perspective. There are a couple of ways of incorporating ethics, and there are models that differ around the world. One of the ideas is to have a core course in agricultural ethics, and there are curricula around the world that require all of the students in a college to complete a core course in ethics. In many cases, that course is offered through a philosophy department, and an ethicist will be in charge of teaching. Others offer that through an agricultural curriculum, but it's a single course that is required of all students who complete that program and obtain a degree. Most of the time, it's team taught, an ethicist and an agricultural scientist. Generally, these courses will start out by helping students to understand different ethical theories. On what basis do people make decisions? And how do they use them to make those kinds of decisions about GMOs or animal production? And then students can explore those theories in the specific context of the agricultural topics that are brought into these individual classes. There are advantages to this approach. All the students in a curriculum, all the students in an institution will receive a course in ethics. And having someone who understands both ethics and agricultural sciences involved in the team teaching can bring those two perspectives together in oftentimes a very powerful way for the students. It gives enough time for our students to understand how people can possibly be intelligent and have the exact opposite opinion that I do about a scientific topic, which I think is critical for them to function in our society. The scientist can help the student understand that there are values even as we conduct scientific research. Another advantage is that all of the students in an individual institution will take the same course. So you get cross-fertilization of students in animal science, in food, in crop production, in plant pathology, in soil chemistry. There are some challenges. If the course doesn't already exist, it's hard to add an additional required course to just about any curriculum I have ever seen in colleges of agriculture. And then in many cases, there's a faculty governance process. The faculty have to say, yes, this is a good idea to add something. Getting all agricultural faculty at any of your institutions to agree on an individual course that's required can be a bit of a challenge. Getting them to agree that that course should be an ethics course, I think, is even more difficult. The course may, in fact, be too generic, that if a student is in soil chemistry, they may not be particularly interested in the ethical issues of animal production. And then, kind of relating to the question that was asked of the previous speaker, there is a cost, even on this very specific kind of a situation of faculty salaries. And then adding an additional course in a requirement oftentimes does not meet with a whole lot of student support. So in consideration of a core course, one important thing is to do groundwork. If in fact an organization is interested in adding a required core course, there almost is a political process that needs to take place to convince faculty that that's an important part of a curriculum. The ethicist will need to have, if it's a course that's team taught, will have to have some background and interest in agricultural issues. I invited an ethicist to a course that I teach on research ethics to doctoral and postdoctoral students. She was a brilliant ethicist. Her expertise was in gender issues, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transvestites, transgenders, and the examples that she used were ones that really the students couldn't relate to, so there was a good bit of a disconnect there. Agricultural scientist needs to have a background and interest in ethics, of course. Where in a curriculum should you put this? Should students get this at the very beginning of the time that they are pursuing the degree, or should it come at the end? And if every student in an organization has to take it, it has to be offered sufficient times so that everyone can meet. And then decision has to be made, is this an in-depth course? In our system would be a 3-credit course that would offer it 3 times a week, or one that you could do in a survey just a single time. Another option, instead of having a core course that all students are required to take, is to consider taking ethics, and I call it decentralizing it, putting ethical content into the specific content-related courses in the disciplines that we are involved in. It could be a module where you take a week or 2 weeks out of a class and talk about ethical issues. It could be incorporated in specific topics in a plant breeding course. When you begin to teach about plant transformation, you can bring in discussions of GMOs from an ethical perspective. It can be taught in a beginning course in a curriculum, capstone course, upper division, lots of options there. It can be included in just one course or a number of them. And of course, the amount of time spent in each of these courses can vary as well. So there's a significant amount of flexibility that's available. The advantages of this decentralized approach is that an individual faculty member can incorporate that into his or her course. In our case, you don't even need any kind of permission. And if a department, say in my case, the horticulture department, decides that it wants to require ethics in a course, there's only one course that needs potentially to incorporate that. One of the other advantages is that the ethics are specific to a student's discipline. And so this really helps the students to see the relationship of their discipline to ethical decision making. Without that connection, sometimes the students fail to realize the value of this kind of a process. There's no new curriculum that's required, which is of value, no new faculty salaries, and the flexibility will allow it to fit into just about any curriculum. Disadvantages, there are a number of them. Agricultural faculty oftentimes don't feel qualified to teach ethics. We're not ethicists, we're soil scientists and plant geneticists. Oftentimes they don't see the value, they don't have the time, and if we end up incorporating it at that decentralized level, we may find that only some students in some disciplines get the exposure and other students don't. They oftentimes don't get exposed to the ethical theories. And while for scientists this might be a difficult thing to understand, I think once students realize that the ethical decision-making process is based on a process and based on theory is important, and at least some discussion of that in our curriculum, I think, is a valuable issue. It may be that we teach it on such a superficial level in this context that it really doesn't end up benefiting the students. Another issue is that students in a single discipline course may be fairly homogeneous, resulting in relatively little exposure to other topics. In one of my research ethics classes, I asked the students to consider the use of animals in agricultural research and in veterinary research. And I had a process where students stood in line, and if the stage was my classroom, I'd say on this side of the classroom, if you are opposed to any kind of use of animals in research, stand over here. If you are in favor of any kind of animal research, as long as animals are used appropriately, stand over there. And if you aren't sure where you stand or you're kind of in a gray area, you can put yourself accordingly. 95% of the students were over there, and there was one person over here. So the discussions ended up being fairly limited. I found out later that of those 95% that were over there, almost all of them were doing either their doctoral research or postdoctoral research with animals. So that ended up limiting the heterogeneity in that group, and that can be a challenge because those discussions are very important. Considerations for decentralizing. If that is a way to go, even though individual faculty may do it, if that's going to be a policy, there has to be some upper administration perspectives. Other thing is, do you bring in an ethicist? And as I pointed out, I think it's very important if faculty members do that, that the person that they bring in has an understanding of agricultural issues. Because without that, part of the reason for the decentralization is to help students understand the relevance of taking a look at these value issues, these ethical and societal issues that are a part of what they're going to be doing once they get into society. I told you this was going to be a very ground-based perspective. How do you teach it? There are a number of different ways. The easiest way, of course, is to do the way we taught, as your slide said before, like they do back in the Middle Ages. Give them a lecture, give them a couple of readings, and then give them a test. It doesn't work any better in ethics, and probably works worse in ethics than it does in any of our specific disciplines. What I found in teaching ethics has worked extremely well at case studies, where we give the students a very specific scenario and then ask different questions where they are going to have to come up with ethical responses to those issues and then have the group discuss them. Many of these are available online. You can make your own, even make the students do them. I think one of the things to consider if you do make your own, because I've used so many case studies, make sure that they're tight. You don't want to be too generic with the case study because the students are scientists or scientists to be, and they will pick apart the details and not understand the ethical issues. One of the values of case studies is that oftentimes it lends itself very well to students working together. And group perspectives and group work is critical because as soon as they leave the classroom, they are not going to be working on their own. And giving them some practice in working in groups, even dealing with controversial issues, maybe especially dealing with controversial issues, is of value. Stand and speak, I told you about that before. Hopefully you can get a little bit more heterogeneity when the students get to that point. And then oftentimes in that instance, then we can have students debate their perspectives in a classroom setting. One of the values in doing that is that you can require, because you're the instructor, to have the students argue the opposite side. So in that case, I could have the students on that side argue that no animals should be used for agricultural research. And in that instance, they have to begin to understand the opposite perspective. Another group work kind of an issue is if there are quizzes, have the students do a quiz and then have the students work in group and take the quiz again and grade it a second time and take a look at whether the student scores have increased, and in most cases they have. This can be a very blatant example for the students of the value of working in groups. I've had students create posters. Oftentimes, if you connect them to something that they're interested in, something in popular culture, and they can deal with a topic that's of controversy, they find that that's of value. I have brought in the fine arts. I haven't had the students sculpt, but I have on occasion have them create a song and do the song as part of an explanation of an ethical issue. Haven't done dance. But making sure that even while they're having fun, they understand that there is some science going on, and so they need to include references. News media, you can oftentimes take a look at what happened yesterday and bring it into a classroom, talking about ethical issues in agriculture. There's obviously a lot of pushback to adding agricultural ethics. If there wasn't, there would be more opportunities to see that in curriculum. The arguments against it, I think, end up being of two types. One, there's no room in the curriculum. And considering the disciplinary quantity of what the student should master, I think we can easily address that because there's not enough time right now for the content. There's no room for the content that they need to know. But they need to learn how to learn. And incorporating these kinds of issues can help them in that process. The other is that values don't have a role in a science curriculum. We should not be teaching ethics, we're teaching scientists. When we bring in these kinds of ethical issues, I think we can help the students understand that science is value-laden, and particularly in agriculture, where we are talking about interpretation and application of the sciences, having the students understand the value is very important. We talked about global warming, and it was very interesting to see a recent Pew Charitable Trust poll that showed that 69% of the public, at least in the United States, thought that scientists studying global warming were making up the data. So, as our students graduate and contribute to greater society, they are going to influence the food system, they are going to influence public perception, policies, and I think one of the best ways we can do that from a very practical perspective is to ground them in the sciences and then help them understand the values and the ethics associated with the decision-making process and give them some opportunity to experience that before they end up going out into the real world. Thank you.